Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see so many people here at this very exciting seminar this afternoon. We have an excellent speaker with us. It's Abisola Barber, and she is devoted diversity and inclusion champion and widely recognized in the financial services for her work. And because we have so many students in the room, it's really interesting to also let you know that Abisola graduated from UoY in 2013 with a BA honors in philosophy, politics, and economics, and is currently global trading business manager at the Global Investment Bank. Now, she has a very impressive history. She has won multiple awards. Winning Young Professional, Abisola has been recognized by the likes of Financial Times, Yahoo Finance, and the Global Thinkers Forum and The Telegraph. Now, I won't keep you much further, but hand it in a minute to Abisola. I just wanted to encourage everyone to use the opportunity whilst Abisola is speaking to use the Q&A functions and hand it over to you now, Abisola.
Great, thank you so much, Anna and Peter, and good afternoon. Thank you to everyone that has dialed in and is joining for this Equality Matters series masterclass. Hopefully you can all hear me, but if there are any issues whatsoever, please do use the chat functions and let us know, and we'll try to manage that in the background. But again, a thank you from myself to Anna and Peter. Thank you, Anna, for that lovely introduction. And so this afternoon, I will be speaking to you all on challenging the status quo and what that means to break the glass ceiling. Now, hopefully my screen share functionalities will actually function this evening, and I will be able to walk you through that presentation. But do bear with, as the technology may decide to fade in and out, shall we say. But as I mentioned, we'll be talking about challenging the status quo and breaking the glass ceiling. So a little bit about myself first before I go through the basis of my presentation this evening. So as Anna kindly mentioned, I am a global trading business manager, also known as a chief operating officer. And I've been doing this role for the last sort of 3 to 4 years, but I've worked within the financial services industry and in investment banking for the best part of the last decade. I do have 2 degrees. I went to York between 2010 to 2013, where I studied my undergraduate degree in philosophy, politics and economics. I then went on to UCL in 2014 to study international public policy. Now, this evening's masterclass series is within the Equality Matters stream. So the reason why I'm presenting and speaking with you all this evening is actually through my involvement in the diversity and inclusion space. And that is actually where a lot of my awards and recognition has come in from, in partnership with the work that I've done through my professional work in financial services. So a number of the awards and recognitions that I've very, very grateful to receive over the years through a range of my different items and aspects of involvement within the diversity and inclusion space, and actually really trying to champion that within the workplace and within the professional services sector. So I will start the presentation, and as I mentioned in the title, we're talking about glass ceilings. Now, this may be a term that some of you may be a little unfamiliar with, so I wanted to start with a very good definition. I think understanding the crux and the basics of topics is a great way for us to start unpicking and unraveling how this topic and matter can impact, influence, and how we can actually start making a change and making a difference. So fantastic definition here of glass ceilings. And I think the most important thing to highlight here is the fact that whilst they may be unseen, sometimes unacknowledged, and often intangible, the problem really with glass ceilings is that they are unbreachable, and they are this unbreachable barrier to advancement. Now, typically they do prevent women from attaining these upper level or more senior positions in the workplace. I have also included and minorities in that definition, because indeed there are glass ceilings that do impact and try to prevent minorities, be that from a race and ethnic perspective, be that from a gender perspective, which we'll focus on, be that from a sexuality perspective. There will be a number of different glass ceilings that each different aspect or different quality that people may possess that may prevent them from rising to the top. Now, this presentation, just for the sake of time and to make sure I can get as much information across as possible to you all, we will just be focusing on the gender diversity aspect of glass ceilings, but I do wholly acknowledge and appreciate there are a number of other aspects to glass ceilings that can prevent and try and stop others from reaching those higher levels. So we talk about diversity and inclusion, and what does that really mean? I won't be going into too much detail in this slide. I don't want to read too much to you, but there is what I like to think of the who, the what, and the how when we look at items and aspects of diversity and inclusion. You know, the who are we talking about? Specifically, person to person, individual to individual, who are we talking about? And what is it about them that we are talking about that we want to make sure we have that diverse, broad palette in front of us? So be that what characteristic, be someone's age, looking at the different gender, looking at the different age and generational disparities that there may be in the workplace. We mentioned gender, and that is what I will focus on, looking at the gender differences. Sexual orientation is another big one that comes up within organizations and efforts that they are doing to shift and really change the diversity and inclusion space. But it doesn't just rely and lean on these slightly more publicized or broadcasted items and aspects of diversity. There are other things such as mental health, someone's education and background, someone's accent. All of these are different qualities and characteristics that can contribute to someone's what makes someone diverse and their diversity characteristics. And then when we want to look at inclusion, that is really the how. The what and the who we've understood, what are those characteristics and who are those people? But how are we trying to create that safe space? How are we trying to ensure that we are in an environment that people can feel valued, that they can feel respected, motivated, engaged? What are these different practices that we are doing to ensure that we can create that? And the reason why I want to start with a very clear understanding of diversity and inclusion is this will hopefully give you a picture of why glass ceilings are such a barrier and why they're important for us to try and dismantle. Because very clearly, if there is a ceiling, if there is a barrier, if there is something that is preventing a certain type of person from progressing and proceeding, that is not ensuring we have a diverse workplace. That is not ensuring we have an inclusive workplace. So what do we need to do to tackle that? Now, I want to look at whether those who are actually impacted by the idea, by the topic of glass ceilings, are they actually worsening the issue? And it's an interesting take and one that I found quite interesting when I was researching this. What is it? And as I say, we're specifically looking at the gender diversity aspect of glass ceilings. So what is it that women may be doing that may be worsening the glass ceiling that is faced against them? And just a few points that I came across as I was doing this research. So firstly, they do not ask for more, or typically they do not ask for more. And this centers around the concept of negotiation, usually around pay. That is where negotiation does tend to come in. And we have seen through the gender pay gap reporting over the past few years, there is that disparate that discrepancy between male and female pay across a number of different sectors. And typically, women are the ones who are not asking for more. They are not necessarily the ones who are pushing and fighting for that larger paycheck or that larger bonus, as we have seen quite often in a number of different sectors and industries. Number two, typically women may be the ones that are shying away from conflict for fear of any form of negative connotation. That may be for wanting to try and be a peacekeeper and not sort of muddy the waters or disrupt the environment. But typically you do also tend to associate the slightly more nurturing, the more mothering, the more kind, the more, shall we say, peacekeeping qualities and characteristics with women, whereas we have seen and we do unfortunately tend to ascribe those slightly more aggressive or demanding or unafraid to challenge characteristics to our male counterparts. Third, in terms of undervaluing skill sets and shying away from slightly harder or technical skills. And I will come back to this point slightly later in my presentation, but this is based on the idea and the concept that you may see a job application, and a typical male will see the 10 items, and 6 out of 10, yes, I think I can do those, will apply for the role. Whereas typically females will feel that they need to satisfy the significant majority of the items on that list before they feel confident enough to apply. And that is about undervaluing or not giving the true value, importance and recognition to their skill set, and therefore benchmarking themselves lower than they really should be. Point 4 is on requiring additional flexibility in their schedule, and this again is baked around the motherhood or the carer qualities that women have had to uphold or typically do so in society. So whether that is having to require the flexibility for childcare, require the flexibility again for that maternity leave pre and post, for looking after other members of the family, especially elderly, that requirement for flexibility we've seen in the past has been more on the female side than it has been on the male side. I think one of the benefits actually of COVID-19 is allowing everyone to now be more confident in asking for this additional flexibility. We're all now slightly more aware of the responsibilities that everyone has from working from home or being in a slightly more distributed working arrangement. So I will actually hope to see some change in point 4 in the near future, but typically it has been more ascribed to females than it has been to males. And then finally, often behave more risk averse. Again, this is slightly linked to point 2 on the list, but females are more likely to be more risk averse, more cautious and more protective of the decisions and outcomes, versus males who are typically more happy to go for the slightly riskier proposals that are out there. So then what are the pitfalls that are then preventing gender balance? What are the things that are not helping us really penetrate these glass ceilings and break them down? So again, you'll see a theme of 5 throughout my presentation. I do like to stick to 5 key helpful bite-sized points that you can look out for. And there is an additional point towards the end of the presentation just as a bonus one. But 5 key pitfalls really then that are preventing gender balance. Firstly, microaggressions. Now, research has shown, and I'll dive a little bit more into the McKinsey report later in this presentation, but research has shown that 4 in 5 women experience some form of microaggression in the workplace, be that somewhat sexual connotations that are made within the commentary that is made in the workplace, be that comments about dress, be that comments about performance. These small, somewhat covered and hidden in an insignificant comment are actually known as microaggressions, points that if taken when said in that context may appear on the face to actually be a kind or a nice thing to say, but actually there are hidden aggressions beneath that context and beneath that point. And whilst we still have the presence of microaggressions that are preventing women from progressing, that are impacting women's behaviour, impacting their ability to perform at their best, we will not be able to continue to push for greater gender balance. Number 2 looks at the lack of networking or sponsorship opportunities. Now, this is one that is developing over time, and there have been very, very strong advances in recent years to try and encourage and turn this. But, you know, we've heard of the old boys club, we've heard of those sort of member networks, often hidden and discreet, of promoting people you know, or supporting and working within that familiar network. And previously, unfortunately, women did not necessarily have the exposure to those networks. They did not have the exposure to sponsors and senior people who will look out for them and champion them. And in particular for junior women, only 1 in 10 will be sponsors of junior women. So who is then calling out and trying to lift up the junior women into the higher managerial pipeline? Number 3, again, this point on flexible working, as I mentioned, and the almost penalty that there is for motherhood or for caring. Now, this is tied in also with the idea of wanting to be always on, and that presenteeism quality that women may sometimes want to try and exhibit, you know, particularly if you are off or have taken time off to look after a child or look after a loved one. You will want to try and make time. You will want to try and show that you are there, that you are present, that you are able to do and fulfill all of the hours and the time that you may have missed otherwise. But actually, that will negatively impact, and 65% of mothers had negatively been impacted by trying to push for this always on culture, even though really they required that flexible working. And it is also then the stigma that previously surrounded the idea of flexible working. You know, so often it had been said that, oh, X and X and X or so and so isn't in the office today. Are they really doing any work at home? And that perception of just because you aren't visible and you aren't present was often associated with therefore you are not doing work, and the penalties that then surrounded that. The fourth pitfall that I will touch upon is on recruitment practices. And this is an interesting one where previously we'd seen all male panels, be that through actual choice or just the way that things had landed. But typically recruitment panels did not have the appropriate diversity for the candidates that they were trying to then recruit for, which then again obviously adds to that layer, be it through biases, be it through microaggressions, be it through the inability for the candidate to see someone that looks like them and represents them. The idea of job descriptions and the performance review language that's then used. This is what I was mentioning about the slightly harder or more technical skills and the confidence to be able to want to apply for these types of roles that very clearly dictate these slightly harsher terms or more technical skills that are slightly more and have tended to be more aligned to male characteristics and male filled roles. Whereas if a female is then applying to a role that has been shaped and described and put across in that way, that is not necessarily likely to have that transferability from a hiring perspective. And then the point on here on the broken rung, which we will come to in a bit more detail shortly, the idea here of not being able to pass that first level of management. So after entry level, the gap and that broken rung, how do you step up to the next rung on the ladder if the first rung is broken? The final point here is on the confidence gap, which I previously mentioned earlier. So the idea of women needing to be far more confident than men when it comes to applying or putting themselves forward for roles, and therefore actually preventing and reducing the number of applications and prospective candidates that can then go forward to try and then break that glass ceiling. So I mentioned the broken rung, and there's a fantastic definition here. And I take some of these learnings from the McKinsey and Lean In report on women in the workplace. But the idea of the broken rung is that, as I said, that first step on the ladder is not able to be made because that rung is broken. And there are clear signs that the glass ceiling is cracking. As I've mentioned, there have been a lot of progression that we've seen, you know, through diverse recruiting slates, through improved job description language, through reducing the stigma of needing flexible working, through calling out biases in the workplace. But actually, we do still see this broken rung that is stopping and preventing females from reaching the top or even just reaching that first level. And often the biggest obstacle that females face on their path to senior leadership is actually that first step to management. And that is what we are mentioning here, that broken rung, that first step that is stopping all future steps going forward. And I'll show a very interesting infographic shortly, but it's looking at the number of males that are promoted or hiring, and then that translation onto actually the female counterparts. So how many females are then promoted or hired versus every 100 males. And as I mentioned, I'm only specifically looking at the gender aspects of this glass ceiling. If we wanted to broaden this out and actually look at the true intersectionality impacts, so looking at the impacts not just on women versus men, but looking at, for example, Hispanic or Asian or Black women versus men, looking at the differences in disability, be that disabled women versus abled men. You know, there are even more layers and lenses that we can apply and look at this glass ceiling. And there are often then quotes and discussions and descriptions then saying that actually this one glass ceiling, is it one glass ceiling or is it multiple glass ceilings, depending on the different intersections you have, depending on the different aspects of diversity you have. And that is something to bear in mind when it comes to actually making efforts to shatter the glass ceiling. Are we making efforts to shatter one person's glass ceiling, or are we making efforts to shatter multiple? So as I mentioned, I wanted to come onto this infographic. It's a really brilliant display of actually the differences there are. So as I said, on the left-hand side, we're looking at for every 100 men that are either hired or promoted at the different levels of management, that's the number of women that are either hired or promoted. So you'll see the darker teal is the number of women hired, and the slightly hashed out teal is the women promoted. And we look from the bottom of the ladder, so the very bottom rung, for every 100 men hired, or rather, yes, every 100 men hired or promoted into an entry-level role, 92 women are hired into that entry-level role. And that seems somewhat equal. And that is actually what we do see and typically expect. And as you go higher and higher up the ladder, you'll see that that actually changes. Now, from at the manager perspective, every 100 men hired or promoted translates to 72 women either hired or promoted. And that is that broken rung. That is that step that we're talking about that doesn't actually translate and allow women to progress on that path to leadership. Now, the eagle-eyed among you will notice actually that the number of women promoted and hired does actually improve as we get higher and higher up the ladder. And that is actually thanks to a lot of the efforts that have been channeled through and really baked into hiring practices, recruitment practices, and ensuring actually that the culture of industry and the culture of different companies really does have diversity and inclusion at its heart. So you will see that actually there are more women that are now being hired or promoted for every 100 men as you get to the VP level, the senior vice president level, and the C-suite. But actually, if we then focus our attention on the right-hand side of the screen and we see that translation in a typical company, actually we're not quite there, and we do actually appreciate that that representation isn't what we would then think it is, just purely by looking at the data on the left-hand side. So as we see at that bottom entry level, whilst we are almost on par, you know, the 92 women for every 100 men, there is still that gap. That gap actually shows even more, and we do still have quite a significant imbalance even at the entry level. And as we then move higher and higher up the rung, we notice that gap continues to widen and widen and widen. So whilst there is a lot going on to increase the promotion of women, to support the promotion of women, and to eliminate this gap and to really, really penetrate into this glass ceiling, we can very, very clearly see that this broken rung does still exist. And actually, once you make that step up from entry level to manager and then trying to go even further, we see that gap widening. And that is where we need to continue to focus our efforts and continue to make change and progress there. So as I mentioned, this broken rung, and this is a very, very great cartoon picture of that. You know, it's far simpler for the men to climb the ladder and to progress from entry level to manager to senior manager, whereas it's very, very difficult actually for women to do that because that step is broken. So how do you progress and how do you make that leap and progress in your career if you have a broken step in front of you, a broken rung in front of you that's preventing you from doing so? So let's talk about a couple of steps and what we can do to try and fix that broken rung. And number one is setting very clear goals. And actually, it's not just about clear goals, but measurable goals for getting more women into that first level of management. And there are a number of different ways of doing so. Some companies, some people, in fact, actually are not necessarily in favor of quotas. Often that actually does work. But the most important thing here is that it's not just for optics. It's not just setting a quota for quota's sake. What is the actual reason and rationale, and what are you then going to do with that change in goal and the achievement then of that goal? But if you have those very clear goals, those very measurable goals, you will then be helping and helping progress women through to that first level of management. The second point is on hiring, as I've called about in a number of different slides throughout this presentation, making sure that hiring is diverse and the promotion slates are diverse. And what we mean by that is when you are in a company and you are looking to promote someone or hire from a selection, making sure that that selection is fair and balanced and diverse. It is not skewed in any one way to a particular intersection or type of person, making sure that, you know, whether you want to go for a 50-50 balance of male-female candidates, whether you want to go for a 30% requirement of all promotions to be female, whatever that requirement or goal is, making sure that actually the slate itself is diverse. Number 3 is on unconscious bias training, and this is a fantastic point, and one that I very much champion and support and approve of, and is actually becoming more and more embedded across a number of industries and companies as time progresses. And that is it's a really, really fantastic move that companies are now recognizing that actually we all have these hidden unconscious biases, these thoughts or misconceptions or preconceptions of how we expect certain people to behave, whether that's due to their race, whether that's due to their gender, whether that's due to where they're from, you know, and how do we understand and become aware of what these biases are, so that we can actually put them to the side and not have them play such a significant part, but be aware that we have them, and how can we actually remove them and be more open, be more inclusive, and be more welcoming to everyone. Number 4 is establishing very clear evaluation criteria. So when it comes to understanding and checking, actually, is that person suitable for the next level? Is that person ready for the next stage? What is the criteria to which you will be basing that on? Are you basing it purely on your network, which is that idea and the concept around the old boys club supporting one another? Or is it actually based on people's quality? Is it based on their ability to do the job? And making sure we have that very clear criteria of what is actually being sought after, and therefore we can hire the best person for that job. And then finally, point number 5 here, putting more women in line for this step up to management. And that is the idea actually of making sure you have that pipeline ready, be that through targeted training to make sure you have that pipeline ready, through encouragement and career coaching to make sure more women step up and put themselves forward. But if you don't have that pipeline, that base population to be selecting from or to be pushing forward, then you will not make much progress in actually ensuring that more women get up the managerial ladder. So it's actually very, very important to ensure that you have that base to select from and to pick from. Now, what practices in organisations can then be adopted and applied to make sure we can make these progressions? And those of you that are obviously part of the management school, a number of these will touch upon key aspects and key topics that you may be learning about in different modules that you've selected. But just to go through these, and these will ring familiar with those that are not necessarily at the university, but also in the industry and the general public that have joined us. But target tracking. How do you tie your performance to your targets? How do you know that you are then actively achieving those goals that we said that we need to be set? Number 2, in the recruitment world, what is then the training? What is the reward? What is the recognition? What is that good practice that we need to be aware of? You know, is it, for example, setting a 50-50 promotion policy? Is it setting that gender balanced hiring slate? You know, where can we be more transparent with our pay, with our bonus, with ensuring that we are actually being fair to all, regardless of gender? What are these key items of good practice that we should be adopting and putting into place? Number 3, reworked working policies. This is one that I support and very much champion, particularly around the typical gender roles for families, you know, making sure that it's not just females that take the maternity leave, but actually what paternity leave policies are in place to make sure it's fair for all. And that's to do with making sure that not only females are the ones that are taking time off, but actually how do we make sure the fathers in the family or those that are taking up that role have the appropriate support that they need, the flexible working they need. You know, there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all policy that will surround that. You know, role modeling from the top, and the idea here is how do we make sure the most senior figures are actually setting the tone, setting the standard for the rest of the organization. And that is very, very important, to have that inspirational leadership layer that will then trickle and penetrate down to the lower layers. And also a returns program. You know, what is there that can be done to encourage people to return back to work, be that women that have taken time off for personal reasons, for familial reasons, for care reasons. What are we doing to encourage and support them in their transition back into the workplace? Structured sponsoring and mentoring. I talked about the gap that there is in mentoring opportunities and sponsoring opportunities for females. And as I mentioned, that is developing and progressing as we speak. But what can we really do to formalize and to really, really embed the idea of mentoring, having that guide, that coach that can help and support you through your career, be it both reverse mentoring or the typical mentoring. You know, what sponsorship programs can we get to really allow women to tap into a pool of senior figures that can help them grow in their career, that can speak their name in the room when they are not necessarily in that room, and that can help support their promotion. And then the fifth point here is men as change agents. And it's very, very important for me as well. In particular, one thing that I do push for in my work in diversity inclusion is making sure we don't alienate anyone. So whilst we may be talking about the glass ceilings impacting females, what can men do to actually support females in breaking that glass ceiling? So calling out bad behavior is a key one. You know, what are those biases? What are those microaggressions that may be heard in the workplace? What are the key behavioral insights that the male perspective can then offer to help call out this bad behavior and stop it from further impacting and preventing their female cohorts from rising in their careers? And the allegiance of males as allies. And that is very, very important, to have males supporting the gender agenda. It's not men versus females, it's men and females working together in partnership. And then finally, what can we do as individuals? What can you do to break the barrier, both in your current state, whether you're a student, whether you're a colleague, whether you're an employer? What can you do to break that barrier? And I did mention that I'll throw in a sixth point for a bonus round, so you'll see 6 points on this slide rather than 5. But number one, what can you do? Nurture your network. Your network is your net worth, and what you do to grow and invest in your network and to nurture it and to cultivate it will be beneficial for you and for your career. So what can you do to expand the people that you know, the company that you keep, the ideas that you're becoming more learned of? You know, the more people that you interact with and network in, the broader perspective that you will have, which will help with your decision making. How do you invest in yourself? What are you doing from a self-development perspective? Whether you decide to take specific courses, whether you decide to learn a different set of skills, what are you doing to truly invest in yourself and make your own personal currency worth more when you want to cash that in? How are you staying visible, number 3? And are you seeking the right opportunities? Are you looking out for those chances to progress yourself, be that through investment, be that through nurturing your network? What are you doing to make sure your platform is there and people recognize you? And that leads on really nicely to number 4, about your personal brand. What is it about you that people recognize? Do you own your personal brand? Are people very instantly aware of, oh, these qualities, yes, I can ascribe those to that person? You know, what are the first few things that people think about when they see you and when they recognize you? And ideas about your personal brand also very clearly linked to the first impressions that you may make on people. So how do you own your personal brand? Number 5, how do you manage the expectations that others may have of you, but also how do you manage expectations of yourself? And it's a very fine balance to land here. So if you understand what your capabilities and your abilities are and what you can contribute, that will further boost and embolden you to actually understand what you can then contribute and the difference you can make. And then finally, thrive as a leader. And I included this point as a bonus point because everyone is a leader, everyone is influential. You do not necessarily need to be a senior vice president or sit in the executive suite to be a leader. Everyone can influence everybody in any way, shape or form. Even just meeting, for example, the postman outside the door as they deliver the door, you can influence them by your friendly demeanor, by your personality. So how do we thrive in those positions? How do we make sure we are doing the best that we can be? The best that we can do to be the best versions of ourselves that we can be, to then eventually thrive as leaders. So I will stop there. I appreciate I've provided quite a lot of information to you all, but hopefully very valuable. And I will hand over to Anna.
Thank you very much, Abisola. Do you want to stop sharing your screen so people can see both of us?
Absolutely, no problem. There we are.
Lovely. Thank you so much. That was really fantastic. And you should have seen the activities or questions merging as you were talking. We have so many questions that I can say it straight out that we're not going to be able to cover all of them, but we're going to take them in order in the way that people voted for them. So the most popular question that most people voted for will be asked first.
Okay.
So I will fire away here, and the first question that people voted for most is about microaggressions.
Okay.
The question is there assumption that this microaggression is across genders?
It's across genders. It's interesting actually, because microaggressions can impact everyone. They're not necessarily males sort of emitting microaggressions to females. Females themselves can emit microaggressions to other females. You know, as a Black person, another Black person can state a microaggression to me. It is not necessarily one axis versus the other. They can actually be into that particular intersection. But particularly looking at the glass ceiling sort of proposition and how we really can break that down, we're focusing actually on the microaggressions that women will face as a whole. So, you know, you look very pretty today. Are you sure you're not too tired? Or are you sure you're up for doing this? You know, you might want to do a slightly easier or softer task, or you know, someone speaking over someone in a meeting. All of these different items and aspects can count towards microaggressions. You know, a key fundamental one that's often said, particularly within the race dynamic, is oh, you speak very well, or you're very learned. I wouldn't necessarily have expected that from you. And whilst that may sound like a compliment, actually what it's insinuating is, I would not have thought someone from your background or from your particular type of diversity would behave or sound like you do. So you can understand the very micro, that's why it's called microaggression, that inference that there can be. And absolutely it can be women to women, but we are focusing here on others to women.
Well, that's really interesting. There's another question here, and this person, Alice, asks, to what extent do women shy away from conflict, less because they do not want conflict, but because others react more strongly and negatively to women who negotiate the result of the neutering peacemaking stereotype? Is that something that you recognize?
It's interesting. I mean, in my line of work and sort of within the financial services industry, you do actually tend to see slightly more emboldened women in that sense, that aren't afraid to step into the sort of negotiation battlefield or into the conflict battlefield. I do take the point of not wanting to come across as that stereotype of being aggressive or being the angry woman. You know, particularly as a Black woman, that is a trope that I'm sadly having to deal with. You know, the angry Black woman is a known sort of title that's often brandished around. And yes, there will definitely be those recollections that women will have to think about and carefully consider. But at the same time, we do actually really see that on balance, women are shying away because they just don't want to be in that conflict zone. Not necessarily because of the additional stereotypes that they may then take on board, but because they're just not comfortable being there.
So moving on to our third question, this one is, how would you recommend the backlash from other employees in targeting training to specific groups? So this person said, we often encounter the I'm white male and you're approaching, sorry, the question suddenly disappeared. So I don't know what happened to it. So I'm going to have to.
That's okay.
I found it. Sorry. So this person often comes across this scenario. I'm a white male and your approach means that I'm now underrepresented. I find that very frustrating statement. I would welcome ideas of how to overcome this.
I think that's a very fantastic observation. And quite sadly, we're seeing that actually in a slightly different lens, similar but slightly different lens, with the recent Christmas adverts from Sainsbury's. I'm not sure if most people have seen some of the commentary that's come out, but just as a bit of a backstory, and it actually supports this comment, Sainsbury's, the well-known retailer, have released one of their 3 Christmas adverts for 2020, and this first advert looks at a Black family celebrating Christmas. And the comments that have been received and have continued to sadly come through are sadly, you know, I am a white male. This does not represent my Christmas. You know, this is what happened to a white Christmas. This is the United Kingdom. It's not blackdom. You know, all sorts. And sadly, it's 2020, yet we are still experiencing and seeing this. And obviously that is looking at it just from a race perspective, but the same applies, and sadly has applied, to I am a white male or I am a male. Why are you only focusing on females? What about me? I feel very left out. And sadly, the way that system and society has been created has been for males. And throughout, you want to talk about sort of misrepresentation, it's been 100% males the whole time. So, you know, people that often oppose quotas and saying, oh, I don't like a quota of 50% women. Well, unfortunately, you know, the quota before was 100% male. So there's always been some form of quota that's been in place. And I think the powerful thing to do here is actually welcoming and encouraging everyone to the table. And that's my point about making sure we can encourage males as change agents and as male allies. You know, it's not about separating them and keeping them away from the discussion or making them not feel like they are a part of the discussion, but making sure that actually they are very much welcomed. And, you know, what are their thoughts? What are their understandings? We want to make sure everyone is part of the conversation, but we want to make sure that it's equal and fair for everyone. So it's not a case of alienating certain people, be that based on their gender, be that based on their race, but actually making sure we can include everyone in that conversation.
That's a really interesting point. You know, it's you know, inclusion is a very, very complicated and interesting concept. I want to move on to the next question, which is about you know, you started off by focusing very much on you know, behaviors that that women possibly do to impact or have a shape the class scene in some respect. So this person asks, so do you think that focusing on what those who are impacted are doing wrong is less valuable than focusing on those who are in position of power or are doing wrong? It seems like the former position disadvantages women or minorities twice and leads them to being blamed, not just doing enough to make their own case.
That's a very, very interesting take on it. And just to be clear, the idea of understanding and actually, you know, digging deeper into what are the things that typically women have done that may not have been supporting her is not there to point the blame. It's actually to shine a light on that, so that people, all people, not just women, but all people, can actually then reflect on themselves and actually almost use that as a checkpoint to say, have I been doing this? Or are there other aspects of my own characteristics and qualities where I might have been exhibiting this without even realizing? You know, it's actually there to almost serve as a mirror, so that we can then sort of hold the mirror up to ourselves and evaluate ourselves, not to beat us down, but actually to build us up. So I take that point that it may be interpreted as almost beating down, or saying, well, look what else you're doing wrong, or look what else you're exhibiting that isn't helping you. But actually it's more to call attention and remind women in particular, but actually remind everyone, there's nothing wrong with evaluating yourself. There's nothing wrong with evaluating your performance. There's nothing wrong with evaluating your characteristics, because it's all about how do you grow, how do you invest in yourself, how do you develop yourself, and understanding where your weaknesses may be will only help you further narrow that gap on them being a weakness, and then build actually on your strengths.
That's really interesting. I suppose it kind of ties up with the idea that some people need fixing, so that kind of is a counter argument that actually is about pointing out which are the areas that you need to look into. Is there something that I'm contributing? But mainly it's about, you know, channeling your views to aspects that could actually feed into disadvantage of some kind. So the next question has to do with something really different. So this person begins to say is that we're beginning to see women in public roles. Kamala Harris, for example, breaking through the glass ceiling. But another concern is that women are put in leadership position for the wrong reasons and can easily fall off the glass cliff, put into unsuitable leadership positions. Do you have any?
I do, and this is why I like to actually focus on what we can actually do to make sure we're not just putting people into leadership positions for the sake of ticking that box. That's why I say it's not just for optics. We need to make sure that the women we are hiring are still both able to do the job, but also able to do the job well. You know, we don't want to just hire a slate of women just to say, oh, well, actually, you know, our leadership team is 50-50, or actually it's even way past that, it's, you know, 60-40 or whatever percentage you want. You still want quality work done at the end of the day. And businesses are businesses. They need to run. They need to be that generate profit, be that continue to expand, be that to make the impact in the communities that they need to do. And they can't do that if they don't have the people to do that properly. So it's not just about hiring women to, you know, break the visible glass ceiling of there not being women that are there. It's actually hiring the quality candidates that just so happen to be women.
So this question kind of brings us to the realities that we live with today, which is COVID. So in your talk, the slides assumed that the organization will remain strictly hierarchical in terms of grade and position. So the narrative is about promotion. So do you think that post-COVID, there is an opportunity to build flatter organizations?
I think one of the benefits actually of COVID, I mean, we can all talk about many drawbacks, but one of the benefits actually of COVID has been almost equaling and evening out the playing field. We've all been able to then appreciate that everyone has other requirements of their time. Everyone has other things to be doing, but yet we all still bring ourselves to the table. We all still bring ourselves to work, and we all still need to collaborate and work with one another. And it's allowed all of us, as I say, to actually be more open and honest with flexibility and the need for flexibility in their work. You know, I may be in a call and then suddenly the doorbell goes off, or someone else may be on a call and then their child will run into the room whilst we're in a meeting. We all now have that greater appreciation for everyone's wider life and not just in the work context. So I do actually think there may be scope for certain companies in the industries that they sit in to actually reevaluate, okay, well, what is our organizational structure? Not necessarily from a footprint perspective, you know, how many employees do we have, but actually, do we need the management hierarchy that we have, or can we not actually employ and embed a slightly more flatter structure where actually it's built and based on that collaboration, it's based on that working together and not necessarily needing sort of the archaic sole leader to manage the entire the sort of entire structure down. So I do definitely think that there will be reviews in that sense to actually even things out. But I'm also being very realistic in the sense that you do need some form of direction and some form of leadership. So there will, I do believe there will still remain some form of hierarchy, some form of management, because also if there is not a form of management or a chain of escalation, how do you ever effectively get things done? If there are multiple people that sit within that top layer, or there is no sort of sole decision maker, how do you actually get to the final outcome or the final decision? How do you make that selection? How do you make that choice? There does still need to be an arbiter and a person that is in charge and taking that leadership and taking that responsibility. So if we do only have that completely flat structure, how do we then, who is then the decision maker? Who is the arbiter, shall we say? So I think there will be reviews, and some companies may rethink their hierarchy, but I think broadly speaking, we will still have some form of hierarchy. I think business needs some form of hierarchy.
Yeah, so food for thought there. You mentioned in earlier in your talk something about, you know, the importance of calling out behaviors. And this person is specifically interested in this and asks, is there evidence that bystander training does actually increase the likelihood of bystanders intervening in inappropriate situations? Does it work?
Mm. You know, I cannot answer that as a yes or a no. I do not work in HR to give you the appropriate figures. But one thing that I have observed personally from, the increase of, as I've mentioned, unconscious bias training, it's actually having that awareness, the self-awareness, and whether that translates into, someone making that direct action. We've seen in a number of cases that it does, even just through the protesting that has happened throughout this year, particularly on the race side, we've seen that translation from that understanding and awakening has translated into previous bystanders who would just say, oh, I'm not racist, to now being actively anti-racist. There is evidence of that. I can't tell you the facts and the figures, but I think the important thing that we need to be thinking of here is that reflection and that understanding and that awareness that is happening in the person who is becoming aware and almost awakening of the fact that they previously might have been a bystander, or they may not have been stepping up to that situation. And we need more of that, because sadly there are still so many fractions of society that do not believe that they necessarily are thinking in a biased way, or in a biased lens, or it's not a situation where they need to actually make a difference or make an impact. Actually, everyone can make a difference in every situation. No one is worthless in that sense. Everyone's voice has a count. It's worth something. So it's actually, how do we empower people to understand that they make a difference and they can actually make a change?
Yeah. I think the jury is still out about all kinds of training and the impact on how and whether it actually changes behavior, which you sort of rightly pointed out. But there has been a huge awakening of late.
Yeah.
Maybe not necessarily by training, but by other public demonstrations. That have really had a massive.
And absolutely, it may not be formal training. It may not be sort of classroom with a teacher in the front or a presenter at the front doing that. But I do still see it as training in that sense, be that through the influence of social media or the news, that I do still see that as training the mind learning and understanding. So, whilst it may not be a formal sort of classroom-based training, I would still say it's that educational piece.
Mm-hmm. I think, Abisola, we might have time for about 2 more questions or so.
Sure, no problem.
So here's one, and this is about male-generated limitation placed on women are often attributed to errors where the idea of being qualified to fill a role is associated with predominantly masculine characteristics. So wouldn't discourse on gender-neutral role definition be a more valuable source of explanation than statistical equality?
So there is a lot of work that's being done into the impact of gender neutral role descriptions, and I did mention the importance actually of making sure that role descriptions are not in that sort of archaic, exceptionally masculine, very harsh wording and language. And aside from the statistics of just hiring based on that old language, that there is definitely space for improving and for pushing this neutrality of language, this phasing out, because really words are powerful, and I think often people overlook the importance of very simple words. A phrase rather for a role that may say something like, I don't know, an IT role requires significant interaction with senior level management. You can tweak that to soften the words or to change the words into a different turn of phrase. It will still mean the same thing, but actually it's when you use overly technical or overly aggressive or overly strong, and you can very easily research and search for the difference between sort of strong and or slightly more feminine or effeminate versions of words. You can see the actual difference, and even just the feeling that you may feel yourself internally of how those words impact you. So no, I definitely would agree the discourse on using slightly more gender neutral language is a very, very valuable source of understanding what impact that can have on roles and on actually improving the language we have in job descriptions and roles that are available.
Yeah, so true. So I think we only have time for one more question, and I'm going to finish on this one, if that's okay with you, Abisola. And this is
Sure.
about policy action, and it has to do with ethnic inequalities. So this person asks, what do you think policy action should entail to tackle ethnic inequalities?
You know, the talk on race and ethnicity this year has really been fascinating, and I've so welcomed that finally it has been a topic that isn't shied away. It's not one that is sort of left to the bottom of the agenda of, oh, no, we're dealing with gender diversity first, but we'll talk about race and ethnicity later when we get time to. So I think, you know, the presence of it even on the agenda now is significant strides. I think the importance here has been on understanding the perspectives of those who fit into that intersection. And I think that is very, very important for influencing what policy action can then be, because until you understand the scenarios or the situations or what that person from that ethnic background, you know, be it their specific race, be it the country that they're from, or what's going on in the country where they're from, until you understand what that experience is like, until that experience has been shared, you can't base policy around something that you don't know the impact it can have, because the impact will not be the appropriate impact it should be. So I think really, and what we've seen a lot, you know, be that through parliamentary polls and petitions for debate, be that through the increased learnings that's going out through news output, be that the availability of different news channels to really educate not just our policy advisors, but actually the Joe Blogs and the public. Because let's remember, we have our representers in Parliament. They are there to represent our views. So if you want to then go and lobby your MP to be voting on particular matters in a certain way, or to be actually understanding pieces of policy and aspects of policy from a certain lens, we have that power within ourselves to also do that. So I think policy needs to really focus on learning. And until you really learn and grasp and understand what is going on, you can then make the targeted responses that you need to make sure you properly tackle these inequalities. So, you know, I'll take just one before we close. I know we're close to the hour, but the recent research reports on fertility, not fertility, but sort of death of Black women in childbirth. You know, what are the factors that are playing into specifically Black women being more at risk of death at childbirth than any other, than white women or the women from any other race? You know, until we understand what each of those different factors are that are contributing to that, we cannot make the most appropriate policy recommendations to address that. So we really need to understand what the item is at hand, what the situation, the scenario is, and then we can make the best informed decision afterwards.
Abisola, thank you so much. It's been incredible to have you here with us for this hour.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Very powerful, and I look forward to hear more from you in the future. And I think before we close the seminar, I will hand it over to Peter. But thank you ever so much, Abisola, for your input. It's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna.